Manipulative people study reactions before they make moves. They listen for patterns, test your tone, and watch for the moment your energy opens just enough for them to step in. But your silence did not make you easier to control. It made you unreadable. By the end of this message, you will understand why their probing has intensified and how to protect your peace with an intuition shield they cannot map. You have felt this before, even if you could not explain it in the moment. A conversation starts simple. The question sounds harmless, maybe even caring. Maybe it arrives with a smile, with concern in the voice, with just enough softness to make you doubt your own discomfort, but something in you tightens anyway. Your body notices before your mind does. Your spirit registers the pressure before your mouth finds the words. That is not you being dramatic. That is discernment. Because some people do not enter conversations to connect, they enter to collect. They are not just listening to what you say. They are studying how you say it, how quickly you answer, what makes you defensive, what makes you explain, what makes you soften, what makes you feel guilty, what makes you rush to prove that you are good, honest, kind, loyal, reasonable. And the more spiritually sensitive you are, the more disturbing this feels. Not because you are weak, because your system can detect when an exchange is no longer clean. You are picking up on a psychological scan. That is what many people miss. They think manipulation always has to look dramatic. They expect obvious control, obvious hostility, obvious disrespect. But some of the deepest manipulation starts with observation. Quiet observation. Repeated observation. A slow mapping of your emotional terrain. Someone asks what you are doing this weekend. On the surface, nothing strange, but what they are really checking is whether you answer freely, whether you feel obligated to account for your time, whether you leave room for them to insert themselves, whether you sound confident in your own plans or still available for redirection. Someone asks if you are okay. Again, that sounds normal, but sometimes it is not care. Sometimes it is a temperature check. They want to know whether you are tired enough, lonely enough, insecure enough, distracted enough, or emotionally open enough for influence. A manipulative person rarely starts by trying to control your whole life. They begin by learning your access points. They study what gets a response. This is why certain people always seem weirdly informed about your state, your timing, your emotional weather. They notice when your voice changes. They notice when you get quiet. They notice when you are trying to protect yourself, not because they are deeply attuned in a healthy way, but because your reactions help them predict their next move. And prediction is the foundation of control. Once they know what triggers guilt in you, they can press guilt. Once they know what makes you explain, they can keep you talking. Once they know what you fear being misunderstood about, they can keep nudging that wound. Once they know you hate conflict, they can use pressure that stays just below the level where you would openly confront it. That is why the exchange can leave you exhausted even when nothing big happened. Your energy knows when it has been scanned. Sometimes it happens in family settings, sometimes at work, sometimes in friendships, sometimes in romantic situations that looked innocent at first. A person keeps bringing up the same subjects in slightly different ways. They circle your boundaries without naming them. They ask personal questions too early. They pretend curiosity, but the feeling underneath it is invasive. You leave those interactions and realize you gave away more than you intended, and you do not even know how it happened. That drained feeling is not random. It comes from being drawn into an interaction where your nervous system was being read like a screen. And here's the part that matters. Your discomfort is not proof that you are antisocial. It is often proof that your inner warning system is functioning exactly as it should. Many chosen, sensitive, spiritually aware people were trained to override that signal, to smile through it, to keep being polite, to answer because silence feels rude, to explain because being misunderstood feels unbearable, to stay open because boundaries were once mislabeled as selfishness. So when the scan begins, they do not always protect first, they accommodate first. That is where energy starts leaking, not because you are foolish, because you are conditioned to keep access open. But notice what happens when you stop that pattern, when you answer less, when you slow down, when you refuse to decorate your boundaries with long explanations, when you let a question sit for a second and listen to what your body is telling you before you reply. People who are only there for clean connection usually remain calm. They do not panic. They do not push. They do not intensify. Manipulators do. Why? Because your pause interrupts their read. The moment you stop being instantly available, the scan gets less accurate. And the moment the scan gets less accurate, their confidence starts slipping. This is why some people become more persistent right after you begin healing. Not because you are imagining things. Not because you're imagining things. Not because your peace is making you strange. Because your energy used to be easier to decode, and now it is no longer giving automatic access. That shift unsettles people who relied on your predictability. You may have seen this in subtle ways. The minute you become calmer, they ask more questions. The minute you stop defending yourself, they act confused. The minute you stop volunteering your emotional state, they try different angles to get a reaction. A joke, a jab, a concern, a guilt-loaded comment, a just checking on you, a strangely timed message, a casual question that lands with too much weight. They are not always conscious of the full pattern. But the pattern is real. They feel the door closing. And now they need information. What most people call overthinking is sometimes just your spirit noticing a sequence your mind has not fully organized yet. You remember how often the person asks something right before making a demand. You start realizing how often they acted warm before crossing a line. You notice how often their questions were less about understanding and more about calibration. Calibration is the word. They are calibrating pressure, calibrating timing, calibrating tone, calibrating how much force your current emotional state can tolerate before you resist. This is why even small interactions can feel heavy, because they are not small in function. They are feeding a pattern of access, and once you understand that, your past starts making more sense. That conversation where you left feeling exposed. That moment where you answered more than you meant to. That relationship where you always felt observed. That friendship where every vulnerable moment somehow became useful to the other person later. That family dynamic where your sadness, joy, delay, fatigue, or success all seemed to trigger a new response from somebody who needed to stay emotionally ahead of you. You were not crazy for noticing it. You were seeing the anatomy of a psychological scan. First, they make contact. Then they look for openings. Then they test your level of compliance. Then they store the reaction. Then they repeat what works. And after enough repetition, they can start moving through your emotional world almost from memory. That is why this matters so much. If somebody can reliably predict your reaction, they no longer have to overpower you openly. They can guide you, nudge you, time things, say just enough, withdraw at just the right moment, reappear when you are softest, push when you are tired, charm you when you are doubtful, shame you when you are strongest. It becomes subtle control, not because it is weak, but because it is efficient. Yet there is one thing that throws off that whole structure. Inner stillness. Not fake coldness. Not emotional shutdown. Not performing mystery. Real stillness. The kind that comes when you stop letting every question enter you. The kind that comes when you stop assuming access must be granted just because it is requested. The kind that comes when you understand that not every inquiry deserves a detailed answer. Your peace becomes difficult to read when it is anchored. And that leads us into the deeper layer, because manipulators are not scanning you just for entertainment. They need something from your predictability. They need to know what works. A manipulative person depends on rhythm. They need to know whether guilt works better than concern, whether urgency works better than tenderness, whether flattery opens you faster than criticism, whether silence makes you chase, whether confusion makes you explain, whether disappointment makes you fold. That is why some people keep repeating the same odd questions in different forms. They are not confused. They are collecting confirmation. And sometimes the most revealing moment is not when they ask something new. It is when they ask something they already know. That is the twist many people miss. They already know the answer. They know you are tired. They know you said no before. They know where you stand. They know what they did. They know you were hurt. They know you need space. They know your pattern well enough to predict your first response. So why ask again? Because the answer itself is not the main goal. Your compliance is. They are testing whether your answer will stay true under pressure. They are checking whether you will betray your own boundary to keep the peace. They are measuring whether your no can be softened, delayed, spiritualized, or guilted into a yes. They are listening for the crack in your certainty. A simple example. Someone asks if you are free tonight when they already know you said you needed rest. If you immediately start over-explaining, apologizing, and offering alternatives you never wanted to give, they just learned something valuable. Your boundary exists, but it can be negotiated through discomfort. Or they ask, "Are you upset with me?" Not because they genuinely do not know, but because they want to see whether you will minimize what happened to protect them from accountability. The moment you say, "No, it's fine, I'm probably just overthinking," they have their reading. You felt something real, but your need to avoid tension can still be used against you. Sometimes they ask personal questions they already know the answer to because they want to see whether your answer changes depending on mood, pressure, attention, or fear. They want to know if your truth is stable. If it is not stable, they know you are still governable through emotional atmosphere. That is why manipulators need predictability so badly. Predictability lets them plan the path of least resistance. They do not want your full strength in the room. They want the version of you they have already learned how to manage, the apologetic version, the eager to be understood version, the caretaker version, the version that explains too much, the version that explains too much, the version that thinks staying kind means staying available, the version that tells the truth and then immediately waters it down so nobody feels uncomfortable. That version gives away data constantly, but a healed version of you does something different. A healed version of you can feel the question beneath the question. A healed version of you notices when the tone is gathering information instead of offering care. A healed version of you does not rush to reduce someone else's discomfort at the expense of your own clarity. And this is where many sensitive people begin to feel guilty, because they have been taught to treat self-protection like hardness. It is not hardness. It is stewardship. It is realizing that your energy is not a public resource. Your inner life is not available on demand. Your peace is not rude because it is protected. Your silence is not rebellion because it is measured. Sometimes the holiest thing you could do in a manipulative environment is become less readable. Not dishonest, not cruel, just no longer easily extracted. And once that begins, you will notice something important. People who are depending on your predictability do not just dislike your boundary, they dislike your consistency. They dislike that your center is no longer moving every time they apply pressure. Because when your center holds, their old methods start failing, and that is where the next layer begins. Because seeing the scan is one thing. Understanding why you keep helping them complete it is another. There's a leak many people do not notice until much later, and it often starts with the need to explain yourself far beyond what the moment ever required. What looks like communication is sometimes surrender in disguise. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. What makes this harder to recognize is that many good-hearted people do not just get scanned by manipulators. They help finish the map. Not on purpose. Not because they want to be controlled, but because over-explaining feels safer in the moment than holding a boundary in silence. You know how it happens. You say no, but then you keep talking. You draw a line, but then you rush to prove that your line is reasonable. You feel hurt, but before the other person even takes responsibility, you start softening your own experience so they do not feel too confronted. You sense that something is off, but instead of trusting the signal, you begin building a long defense for why your instincts might still be valid. And by the time you finish speaking, the energy has shifted. What started as your attempt to be clear becomes an opening the other person can now work with. This is why over-explaining is so dangerous in manipulative dynamics. It does not just communicate information. It exposes your internal negotiations. A healthy person hears your boundary and respects it. A manipulative person hears your over-explanation and starts listening for the weak seam. They do not only care about the sentence, they care about the hesitation inside the sentence. They care about the guilt in your tone. They care about the places where you sound unsure of your own right to say what you are saying. That is where they enter. So when you say, "I can't make it tonight because I'm really tired and I've had a long week and I just need a little time to myself, but maybe later, and I hope you're not upset, and I'm sorry if this is inconvenient," a manipulative person does not simply hear no. They hear that your no is crowded. They hear that your no still wants permission. They hear that your body is trying to close the door while your mouth is leaving the window unlocked. And that changes everything. Because once someone knows you are uncomfortable with your own boundary, they do not need to oppose it directly. They only need to increase the emotional pressure around it. A little disappointment, A little guilt, a little confusion, a little injured tone, a comment about how distant you have been lately, a reminder of all they have done for you, a suggestion that you are changing in a negative way. Now you are no longer just holding a boundary, you are fighting for emotional oxygen inside a conversation that was designed to make you abandon it. That is why some interactions leave you feeling like you talked for 10 minutes and somehow still lost yourself. You were not just speaking, you were leaking, and a leak does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like explaining your plans to someone who never earned access to them. Sometimes it looks like defending a decision that did not require debate. Sometimes it looks like answering questions with more honesty than the relationship has proven safe enough to hold. Sometimes it looks like confessing your whole emotional process to a person who has repeatedly used your vulnerability to reposition themselves. A lot of spiritually sensitive people do this because they were taught that transparency equals goodness. But transparency without discernment is exposure. That is not wisdom. That is access without covering. There is a real difference between being honest and being over-available, between being kind and being emotionally porous, between communicating and handing someone the blueprint to your pressure points. And this matters because manipulators are excellent at turning your own explanations into tools. They will use your language later. They will quote your concerns out of context. They will present your vulnerability as instability. They will act as though your careful explanation was proof that you are the one creating complications. They will force you to keep clarifying until the original issue gets buried under your effort to be understood. At some point you realize you are no longer expressing yourself. You are performing a case for your own legitimacy. That is a losing position, because the more you try to convince someone who benefits from misunderstanding you, the more energy you hand them to shape the interaction, and that is the trap. Over-explaining feels like self-protection when you are in it. It feels like you are preventing confusion. It feels like you are keeping things peaceful. It feels like maturity, but often it is fear wearing the clothes of communication. Fear of being seen as selfish. Fear of being judged cold. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of conflict. Fear that your quiet no will not count unless you can make it emotionally acceptable to everybody involved. But the truth is, the people who require the longest explanations are often the people least interested in honoring the boundary itself. That is why they keep you talking, not because they need clarity. Because the longer you explain, the more likely you are to disconnect from your center and start negotiating against yourself. Maybe you have lived this already. You went into a conversation knowing exactly what you felt. Then the person started asking questions. Why do you feel that way? What exactly do you mean? Are you sure that is what happened? Why didn't you say something earlier? Do you think maybe you are reading too much into it? Why are you making this such a big deal? Why can't we just move on? And at first you were trying to answer sincerely. But somewhere in the exchange, you begin to feel foggy. Your certainty starts thinning out. You become more focused on sounding fair than staying true. You start editing your own memory in real time just to keep the atmosphere from getting worse. This is one of the most painful things manipulation does. It does not always silence you by force. Sometimes it exhausts your clarity until you surrender it voluntarily. And when that happens often enough, you start losing trust in your own inner witness. That is the deeper cost. Not just the awkward conversation. Not just the drained feeling afterward. Not just the frustration of saying too much. The deeper cost is self-betrayal. Every time you explain beyond truth into appeasement, something in you feels it. Every time you water down what your spirit clearly sensed, something in you records it. Every time you turn a clean boundary into a speech so someone else can stay comfortable, your peace pays the bill. But here's what most people never notice. Over-explaining is not only a speech habit, it is an energy pattern. It reveals where you still believe your inner knowing must be approved before it can be honored. That is why healing this matters so much. You are not just learning to talk less. You are learning to stop outsourcing authority over what you already know. A complete sentence can be holy. I'm not available for that. I won't be discussing that. That doesn't work for me. I need some space. I've made my decision. I'm not going to explain further. Those kinds of sentences feel sharp at first to people who were trained to cushion everything. But they are not cruel. They are clear. And clarity is often the first language of self-respect. Notice something else. When you stop over-explaining, you also stop giving manipulators so many emotional handles. They cannot pull on details you did not offer. They cannot twist a justification you never gave. They cannot study your guilt if you do not perform it in front of them. This is where your energy begins to return. Not because you won the argument, because you ended the extraction. Some people will call that distance. Some will call it pride. Some will say you have changed, and they will be correct. You have changed. You are no longer donating access to people who have only proven they know how to misuse it. There is maturity in that. There is spiritual intelligence in that, because God-given discernment is not just about sensing danger. It is also about responding in a way that does not keep feeding it. And once you begin responding differently, you start seeing the next issue more clearly. It is not only that manipulators want explanations, they also rely on openings in your emotional field. They look for leaks of guilt, leaks of urgency, leaks of loneliness, leaks of the need to be chosen, leaks of the need to be understood, leaks of the habit of checking other people's comfort before you check your own peace. That is what we need to talk about now, because not every energy leak starts in speech. Some begin in the way you carry people long after the conversation has ended. You may leave an interaction physically alone, but emotionally they are still in the room. You replay the tone. You rehearse what you should have said. You wonder whether you were too harsh, too sensitive, too guarded, too distant. You feel them inside your thoughts, as if the conversation is still happening. That is an energy leak too, and manipulators count on it. They do not need constant access if they can keep occupying your internal space. If they can trigger you and then let you do the rest of the work, they've already extended their influence far beyond the moment itself. This is why some of the most exhausting people do not always take up much time. They take up attention. They take up emotional aftercare. They leave residue. Residue is the feeling that stays after contact, the unsettledness, the strange heaviness, the need to mentally defend yourself where nobody is even there, the sense that your peace has been punctured and is slowly draining out through rumination. That is why sealing emotional energy leaks is not just about saying less in the moment. It is about closing the inner doors that stay open afterward. One of those doors is guilt. If you have been conditioned to feel responsible for how everyone experiences your boundary, guilt becomes an easy point of entry. The person does not even have to argue much. A sigh can do it. A disappointed look can do it. A slightly wounded message can do it. Suddenly, you are carrying their reaction as though it is proof you did something wrong. But someone else being unhappy with your boundary does not automatically mean your boundary was wrong. That truth will save you a lot of energy. Another leak is urgency. Manipulative people often create emotional speed because speed bypasses discernment. Respond now. Decide now. Explain now. Clear this up right now. Tell me what is going on right now. The faster the interaction moves, the harder it becomes for you to return to your center. Slow is powerful. A delayed response can be protective. A pause can be protective. A night of sleep before answering can be protective. Silence long enough to hear your own spirit again can be protective. Urgency is not always a sign of importance. Sometimes it is a strategy to keep you from noticing what is happening. Then there is the leak of over-identification. This is when you become so occupied with being fair to the other person that you stop being faithful to your own experience. You begin narrating their childhood wounds, their stress, their intentions, their pressure, their insecurities, their hard season, their good heart deep down, and maybe some of that is true. But none of it should require you to abandon yourself. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure. That sentence matters. You can understand somebody and still refuse access. You can see their pain and still decline the role they keep assigning you. You can pray for them and still stop participating in the pattern. You can stay soft in spirit without staying open to extraction. That is what emotional covering looks like. It is not hard armor. It is wise closure. It is checking your internal gates. It is noticing where your peace keeps draining. It is asking, why am I still carrying this person in my mind? It is refusing to let every conversation become an altar where your energy is sacrificed just to keep the atmosphere calm. And sometimes sealing the leak is very practical. It means not answering right away. It means not explaining your whole schedule. It means not returning every emotionally loaded message immediately. It means not picking up on the first ring just because somebody expects access. It means not trying to end every interaction in total emotional resolution. Some conversations do not need resolution. They need limits. Some relationships do not need one more heartfelt explanation. They need less access. Some people do not need deeper insight into your feelings. They need to feel the boundary they keep trying to talk around. When that begins to settle in you, something powerful happens. Your energy starts consolidating. You feel less scattered, less emotionally drafted into other people's storms, less available for hidden assignments you never consciously agreed to carry, and your peace becomes heavier. That is the phrase. Your peace becomes heavier, not tense, not angry, not guarded in a fearful way, just weighty, rooted, covered, no longer easy to pull out of position with a question, a mood, a guilt trip, or a needy tone. People can feel that shift even before you name it. They notice that you are no longer as interruptible, no longer as emotionally reachable through old tactics, no longer eager to fix their discomfort with your access. This is when the dynamic starts changing for real. Because once the leaks are sealed, the old methods stop finding openings. And when the openings close, control begins to fail quietly before it fails visibly. That visible part is coming next. Because protecting your energy is not only about what you stop doing, it is about what you start embodying. There is a system to this. A way of moving that keeps your intuition covered, your emotions unhooked, and your peace difficult to penetrate. And once you begin using it, silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling like authority. Silence starts feeling like authority when it is no longer empty. And that is where the intuition shield system comes in. Not as a performance, not as a game, not as a way to seem mysterious. This is not about becoming cold, evasive, or emotionally unavailable to healthy people. It is about becoming spiritually and emotionally covered when you sense that somebody is trying to gain access through pressure, probing, or subtle extraction. The intuition shield system is what you use when your body notices something before your mind has fully sorted it out, because that moment matters. A lot of people betray themselves right there, not later, right there, in the first few seconds after a strange question, in the tiny pause after a loaded message, in the moment where they feel the discomfort, but then override it because they do not want to appear difficult. This system protects that moment. The first part is simple, but it changes everything. Notice the signal before you answer. Notice what the interaction is doing inside you. Is your chest tightening? Is your mind speeding up? Do you feel suddenly defensive, rushed, guilty, cornered, foggy, or oddly exposed? Do you feel the urge to explain before anyone has even accused you of anything? Do you feel pulled to manage the other person's emotions before you have checked your own? That signal is not there to be dismissed. It is information. You do not always need proof before you honor a signal. Sometimes your discernment is picking up on tone, timing, pattern, repetition, and motive long before your conscious mind can put it into a neat sentence. A spiritually sensitive person often feels the disturbance first and understands it second. That does not make the signal less valid. It means you need a response that buys your spirit enough time to catch up. So instead of answering immediately, you pause. That is the second part of the shield. Pause on purpose. A manipulative dynamic often depends on speed. The faster you respond, the less likely you are to hear yourself. But a pause interrupts automatic access. A pause keeps you from filling silence with explanations you do not mean. A pause allows the emotional smoke to clear so you can see what is actually being asked of you. Sometimes that pause is only 3 seconds. Sometimes it is, let me think about that. Sometimes it is, I'm not answering that right now. Sometimes it is waiting until tomorrow before replying at all. Do not underestimate what a pause does. It breaks old programming. It tells your nervous system, my response belongs to me. It tells your intuition, I am listening. It tells the other person, access is no longer immediate. And it tells the pattern, you do not get to move me on command anymore. That alone can change the whole atmosphere. Because the person who is used to reading you easily now has to deal with a version of you that does not spill on cue. Then comes the third part. Read the question beneath the question. Ask yourself, what is this person actually trying to touch? Is this a request for connection, or is it a search for leverage? Are they asking to understand me, or are they checking my mood, my availability, my guilt level, my defensiveness, my loneliness, my willingness to bend? Is this question necessary? Is it earned? Is this the kind of intimacy the relationship can safely hold? You do not need to become suspicious of everybody, but you do need to become honest about patterns. Because once you start reading the question beneath the question, you stop answering every inquiry at face value. A person asks, "What's wrong with you lately?" Maybe the deeper question is, "Why can't I access you the way I used to?" A person asks, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Maybe the deeper question is, "Why am I no longer first in line to your inner world?" A person asks, "Are you sure that's what happened?" Maybe the deeper question is, "Can I get you to doubt your own reading before you fully stand in it?" A person asks, "Why are you being so distant?" Maybe the deeper question is, "Why is my usual reach no longer working?" When you hear that layer, you stop responding only to words. You respond to function. And that is what keeps your energy from getting drafted into somebody else's script. Now the fourth part is where most of your protection becomes visible. Answer from neutrality, not from the wound. This is one of the strongest shifts a person can make. If somebody is trying to hook you through guilt, they are expecting guilt back. If they are trying to hook you through confusion, they are expecting you to over-explain. If they are trying to hook you through accusation, they are expecting you to defend yourself emotionally. If they are trying to hook you through false concern, they are expecting you to open the gate and start narrating your inner life. Neutrality refuses the hook. Neutrality sounds like this: "I'm good. I've made my decision. I'm not discussing that. That doesn't work for me. I'm keeping some things private. I hear you. I'm not available. I said what I needed to say." Some people will hear those responses and think they are too brief. But brief is not rude when the atmosphere is loaded. Brief is often what keeps truth from getting diluted. And neutrality is powerful because it does not feed the emotional machinery that manipulation depends on. No extra fuel, no justifying speech, no nervous overreaching, no attempt to make the other person comfortable with your boundary before you are allowed to keep it. At first, this can feel unnatural if you were raised to explain everything. You may feel mean. You may feel tense. You may feel as though you are doing something wrong simply because you are no longer over-functioning. But that discomfort is often withdrawal from an old pattern, not evidence that your new behavior is unhealthy. Stay there. Let your calm become stronger than your fear of being misunderstood, because here's what begins to happen. When you stop answering from the wound, the person probing you starts losing feedback. Their usual tests do not return the same data. They cannot tell if guilt landed. They cannot tell if the jab worked. They cannot tell if the concern pulled you open. They cannot tell whether their silence made you anxious. They are no longer operating with a live map. That is why your peace starts feeling disruptive to them. Not because peace is aggressive, because peace that is covered cannot be steered as easily. Then comes the fifth part of the intuition shield system. Close the interaction cleanly. A lot of people protect themselves well for 30 seconds, then reopen the whole exchange because they feel awkward leaving it unresolved. They say the clear sentence, but then they add 3 emotional paragraphs. They hold the line, but then they circle back later to make sure nobody feels bad. They end the conversation outwardly but reopen it inwardly by replaying it all night. The shield is not complete until the door is closed. Closing the interaction might mean changing the subject. It might mean ending the call. It might mean not replying again. It might mean leaving the room. It might mean deciding, "I've already answered and I will not keep re-entering this just because the other person wants a different outcome." Closure protects energy. And some people need to hear this clearly. Repetition is not intimacy. Just because somebody keeps asking does not mean they are entitled to more of you. Sometimes repeated questioning is simply pressure in a softer voice. You do not owe endless access to prove that you are kind. Then there is the sixth part, and this is where the shield becomes spiritual, not just psychological. Return to yourself after contact. Do not let the interaction continue living inside you unchecked. After certain conversations, sit still. Breathe. Pray. Journal a few honest lines. Name what you felt before the person had time to rename it for you. Let your body come down from alert. Ask yourself, what was mine in that moment and what was theirs? What did I sense? Where did I stay true? Where did I feel pressure? What do I need to close internally so this does not keep draining me? This matters more than people realize, because if you do not return to yourself after contact, you can physically leave the conversation while spiritually and emotionally remaining trapped in its residue. The person is gone, but their tone is still echoing in you. Their doubt is still moving through your thoughts. Their disappointment is still pressing on your chest. Their access continues, not because they are still speaking, but because you have not yet reclaimed the space. Returning to yourself breaks that. It reminds your spirit, I am back under my own covering. It reminds your mind, I do not need their version of the interaction to become my truth. It reminds your emotions, you are allowed to settle without solving everybody else. That is the full intuition shield system. Notice the signal, pause on purpose. Read the question beneath the question. Answer from neutrality, not from the wound. Close the interaction cleanly. Return to yourself after contact. That is how you protect your energy without becoming harsh. That is how you stay soft without staying open. That is how you remain loving without becoming available for misuse. And once you begin living this way, something very revealing starts happening around manipulative people. They become unsettled by your silence, not all at once. Sometimes it starts small. Their messages become more frequent. Their tone becomes sweeter for a while. Then maybe more irritated. Then suddenly more emotional. They try concern again. Then humor. Then confusion. Then guilt. Then acting as though you have changed for the worse. Then trying to pull you into one more clarifying conversation. Why? Because silence removes their feedback. Before, they could measure themselves through your reactions. They knew when you were hurt. They knew when you felt guilty. They knew when you were trying to smooth things over. They knew when to push and when to pull back. Your over-explaining gave them a map. Your emotional urgency gave them timing. Your need to be understood gave them openings. But when your silence becomes grounded, all of that begins collapsing. And what looks like their panic is often just the discomfort of lost influence. That distinction matters. You do not need to imagine dramatic revenge. You do not need to wait for some cinematic downfall. The backfire is simpler than that and, in many ways, more powerful. They lose reliable access. Their old tools stop working. Their reads become less accurate. Their confidence in handling you starts fading. They cannot easily tell what moved you because you are no longer moving from the places they used to touch. That loss of access is enough to change the entire dynamic. This is why some people get visibly agitated when you stay calm. They are not only reacting to your words, they are reacting to the fact that they can no longer locate themselves inside you the way they used to. They can no longer pull your attention at will. They can no longer depend on your guilt to reopen a door you have already closed. Your silence forces them to meet themselves, and many people do not like that. What you will notice is that healthy people respond very differently. Healthy people may not love every boundary, but they can respect one. Healthy people do not need to punish your privacy. Healthy people do not keep testing a no just because it inconveniences them. Healthy people are not threatened by your centeredness. Healthy people do not require your constant emotional transparency to feel secure. That contrast will teach you a lot. Sometimes your new piece will reveal who is truly with you and who is only comfortable with the version of you that had fewer gates. Let that revelation do its work. Do not rush to explain your transformation to people who only liked you accessible. Do not shrink your clarity so old patterns can survive. Do not call it pride when it is really alignment. Do not call it distance when it is really wisdom. Do not call it hardness when it is really self-command. There comes a point in healing where your calling demands that your energy stop being public property. That is not ego. That is maturity. The truth is, manipulators are strongest when you are still unsure you are allowed to protect your peace. They thrive in your hesitation. They thrive in your guilt. They thrive in the part of you that still thinks every boundary must come wrapped in an apology and every silence must be explained. But once that part of you begins healing, their whole approach starts breaking down. And you do not have to break down with it. You can stay calm. You can stay clear. You can stay prayerful. You can stay grounded in your own body, your own timing, your own God-given awareness. You can stop calling your discernment too much just because other people benefited when you ignored it. That may be the deepest shift of all. You stop doubting what your peace has been trying to tell you. You stop forcing access where there is no safety. You stop answering every knock at the gate. You stop offering your interior world to people who keep proving they only know how to use it for positioning. You stop confusing emotional exposure with intimacy. You stop believing that silence makes you powerless. Silence, when it is anchored in truth, is not emptiness. It is structure. It is selection. It is covering. It is a refusal to let every curious hand reach the sacred parts of you. And when people who once studied you realize the signal has changed, they do not know what to do with that. The old map stops working. The old questions stop opening doors. The old pressure stops finding the same entry points. That is the backfire. Not chaos, not revenge, not obsession, peace with weight. If this message is putting words to something you have been sensing for a long time, let that be known. Protecting your energy does not mean you fear people. It means you finally understand the value of what you carry. And when you value what God placed in you, you stop handing it over just because someone knows how to ask for it in the softer voice. So let your intuition stay awake. Let your answers be measured. Let your peace become less explainable. Let your boundaries stand without performance. Let silence do the work of revealing what noise once hid, and move forward with this in your spirit. Not everybody who asks gets access. Not everybody who presses deserves clarity. Not everybody who studies you understands you, and not everybody who loses reach over you has lost because you became cruel. Some have lost because you finally became covered. If this spoke to your spirit, leave your testimony in the comments and pass this message to someone who needs their peace protected too.